Hi, everyone.
Hi there. We're on page 675 of In Search of Christian Freedom. The chapter is still a congregation of free people, and the subhead now is the Christian ecclesia of the first century. Ray starts, the most frequent expression found in the Christian scriptures to describe Christians collectively is the Greek term ecclesia, usually rendered church or congregation. It is notable, however, that this term of itself has no intrinsic religious meaning. Its common use in Greek was to describe an assembly of citizens called together to decide matters affecting their welfare. We find it used in this typical secular, non-religious sense at Acts 19:32, 39 and 41, in describing the hastily called gathering of silversmiths at Ephesus. It is evident that of itself it carries no idea of an organization in the sense of a structured arrangement, but simply that of a gathering of people to consider some matter of mutual interest or of the people themselves so assembled.
In the first century, Christians did not belong to a local ecclesia, church, or congregation in the sense of belonging to or having formal membership in a religious organization. If they gathered with others, they were, by virtue of the act of gathering, part of the local gathering or assembly, ecclesia. The call that drew them together did not come from some religious authority. It was the call of the good news that drew them, a call not merely to share their own thoughts and views, but primarily to hear God's message. And throughout the first and second centuries, when they gathered, it was not in special religious buildings, but in homes. Discussing the term ecclesia, as used by Paul in his early letters, scholar Robert Banks states,
Quote, "Never during this period is the term applied to the building in which Christians meet. Whether we are considering the smaller gatherings of only some Christians in a city, or the larger meetings involving the whole Christian population in that city, it is in the home of one of the members that ecclesia is held, for example, in the upper room," that's Acts 20 verse 8. Not until the 3rd century do we have evidence of special buildings being constructed for Christian gatherings, and even then they were modeled on the room into which guests were received in the typical Roman and Greek household. End of the Banks quote. And then Ray concludes this little section. Similarly, the Expositor's Greek Testament commentary states, up to the 3rd century, we have no certain evidence of the existence of church buildings for the purpose of worship. All references point to private houses for this. And then he cites several passages, and I'll list them in the description, but one of them we should read for sure is Romans 16, 3-5a.
"Give my greetings to Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who have risked their own necks for my soul, to whom not only I, but also all the congregations of the nations render thanks, and greet the congregation that is in their house."
No doubt then that in the first century, the pattern of Christian assemblies anyway was in house fellowships.
Mm-hmm.
But the very fact that you cite Robert Banks here, Robert Banks is not, I find it a little worrying that he's cited in the Watchtower manner as a scholar.
Yeah.
Robert Banks was a clergyman. And being an Anglican clergyman, he wasn't saying that house fellowship should replace larger institutions. He was saying we need both.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a both and.
And because at the time of the early church, they were Jewish Christians, they were already in the habit of going to the synagogue, and they continued to go to the synagogue after becoming believers. So they went to that assembly, and then they had their own assemblies. They just started out, they had those assemblies in their home. And so it would have been a smaller group than, say, at the synagogue.
So we shouldn't take away from this that
It's
one
either
replaces the other.
Yeah.
For the early church, it was an add-on, the peculiarly Christian add-on to what they were already doing as Jews. And the evidence for that is in Pentecost, the Pentecost account. So we're going to put on your screen the link to 7 characteristics of the Christian congregation in the Pentecost period. But also, some would say, well, okay, that was a leftover from their Jewish background. But then you have Paul, 30 years later, in his last visit to Jerusalem, going expressly, Luke says, for the purpose of the festival. He wanted to be there in time for the festival. So Jewish Christians were still in the habit, as you find when Paul gets there, he goes to visit them, and they ask him to go beyond the festival and do something else.
That would be how you'd meet people, too, is going to the synagogue. And it was even a warning of Christ that eventually they'd be thrown out of the synagogues. He didn't say, get out of them. He said, you will be thrown out.
Yeah.
So at some point, they would get resistance from the synagogue.
And that varied from locale to locale. Some places they were more welcome than others, depending on the hostility of the leaders of the synagogue, it would seem. But wherever Paul went, and Barnabas and Silas with him, they were often welcome, at least for some weeks, within the synagogue, and welcome to speak their peculiarly messianic message in that context. So Banks, Robert Banks, cited here, and certainly supportive of the house fellowship movement, one of the most cited authors about that very thing in other circles other than ex-Jehovah's Witness circles. He's already caught on long before Ray Franz got a hold of him. The house fellowship movement was already going because of the very factors that Ray is citing here, that somehow big structures aren't enough, but we can't do without the big structures. That's the point.
Yeah, we can have both. It shouldn't be a taboo of one or the other. I'm thinking also that Paul, in his missionary trips, he hired a building to have meetings in, right?
So he could teach.
Yeah.
School in Tyrannus, for instance. So we'll link on your screen 7 characteristics of the Christian congregation in that early period, and also a video we did on Acts 20 and 21, Paul's last visit to Jerusalem.